Hello and welcome. Today we are doing a mastery class for the Bernina 3 series machines, which is the 325 and 335. This is going to cover the basic operation of the machine, starting from the very basics like winding a bobbin and threading the machine. Then we'll go through basic operation and utility uses. We will go through decorative operation, a few little decorative functions the machine has, as well as how to access the memory and use that memory, for instance, to type in a name using the built-in alphabet. And we will finish with a brief practical section where we go through the big ticket feet, usually that's the buttonhole foot, and then talking briefly about the other feet that are included with this machine. Lastly, we will go through cleaning and maintenance, including how to oil and what the maintenance schedule should be for getting it professionally cleaned. This will be broken up into several videos, so keep an eye out for those as they are produced and released. To start, we need to get all set up. So, you're going to need a power cord and a foot pedal. Foot pedal is optional, and we'll get to that, but you'll definitely need your power cord. It looks like this on one end. The other end is already plugged into the wall, and you have a little power port right underneath the on-off button. So that gets plugged in there, and the switch gets turned to on. The foot pedal goes into a handy-dandy port labeled with a foot pedal icon, and that gets plugged in fully just like that. Now, you'll notice that when I turn the machine on, it makes a little burp noise, a little mechanical noise. That's a calibration noise. It is normal. It either makes it when I turn the machine on or the first time I start sewing. Don't be alarmed by that. It happens to every machine, and it's just checking that it can move the stuff it thinks it should be able to move. Okay, to complete our setup, we'll need a few more things. We'll need a presser foot for one. This is the standard presser foot, and this is the number 1 presser foot. It's going to be hard to see, but there is a number 1 engraved on that foot. The 325 and 335 have clip-on feet, which means if I depress this little red lever back here, the sole comes off. So that way I can swap out for some of my other feet. To put it back on, I simply push down with a slight amount of force to clip that back into place. To put the whole thing on the machine, I want you to notice I've got a hole in the top of the foot, and I've got a cone right here that when I move the presser foot lever, you should see that cone go up and down. So that's the presser foot attachment point. I slip that hole onto the cone all the way up, and there's a little lever back here that I push into place, and it locks under a little nub on the foot. Okay, putting the needle in is going to be really easy. I've got a little needle screw right here, back it out slightly. Insert the needle, make double and triple sure that it's all the way up. I push very hard, and then I tighten down the screw. If it's not all the way up, you will have major issues, so that's a big deal to double check. You do not need to over tighten this screw. Go finger tight. If you over tighten, you risk breaking the point off of that screw, and then it doesn't hold your needle very well at all. Okay, so at this point, we've got our major points on. The table is optional, but it just slips on like this. And then I'll encounter a little point of resistance, and I push through. It engages at this point. To release it, I depress, and I just can slide it off. Okay. Now we're going to go through threading the machine and winding a bobbin. You actually have 2 spool pins on this machine. You've got the main one, which is a horizontal spool pin, and you've got a vertical one back here that pops upright. You're usually going to start using the horizontal spool pin because this is what most threads are designed to be put on these days, but I'll talk about the cases in which you might use the vertical. In this case, we will use the horizontal spool pin and I will immobilize it with a spool cap. That's going to hold that spool still. We don't actually want it to rotate. This is designed to come off the spool without needing to rotate itself. It keeps it nice and smooth, tensionless, less noisy. Okay. From here, I'm going to head to the back of the machine where there's a little metal hook. You'll take my word on it, and I don't have to be able to see the little metal hook to be able to reach down there like I'm reaching for flossing a tooth or something and hook around it. From here, you decide to wind a bobbin or thread the machine. We're going to start by winding a bobbin. I go to the little bobbin tension disc up here, and I make a full turn clockwise around that tension spring. I want you to notice that I kept holding the back of the thread, because if I do this one-handed, it would be like flossing your teeth one-handed. You're going to do a really poor job. You have to give it some resistance so that it pops into the tension spring in there. At this point, I retrieve my bobbin and I stick the thread up from the inside out through one of those holes in the top. Then I reel in any excess I had so that I've got a nice clean line of thread. I hold it above the bobbin and I am going to activate my little bobbin winder lever. Okay, once it's wound up and down the core a few times, I can clip my thread really close. You shouldn't really be able to see the tail. The reason is if you just clip willy-nilly way above the bobbin, you've got a tail that can interact with the bobbin thread as it's being used in a way that we don't like, that could cause issues for your stitching. So we've tried to make it as unobtrusive as possible. I do recommend this method more than the wrap around the core a few times method, because that can sometimes cause the thread to get tied on itself. This is really clean. When this bobbin finishes, it'll come right off the end and not bring your whole project to a screeching halt. Another thing to notice is that this bobbin winder runs as soon as I push it over. I don't have to depress the foot pedal. I mention this because it is very common for people, when they have traveled with their machine, to turn their machine on when they get where they're going or when they get back home and hear a bad noise coming from it, and they can't figure out where it's coming from. Usually it's your bobbin winder that's engaged, and you can't tell because there's no bobbin on it. So just be aware, if you turn your machine on and there's this really weird humming noise, make sure that that's not your bobbin winder. Okay, once I've wound as much as I want, there's a little cutter on the back of the bobbin winder that I can use. If I had wanted a full bobbin, this would have popped away when it was full. I just don't need that much bobbin thread. Okay, so now I've got my bobbin. I need to put it into my bobbin case. There is a right way and a wrong way to do this. When I put it in the bobbin case, it needs to be rotating clockwise as I pull on the tail. Another way to think about this is making a Q for quilt. There's the head, there's the tail of the Q. Very important. Once I know I've got it in that position, I drop it in the bobbin case. And I can pull again just to make double sure, yes, the bobbin's rotating clockwise as I pull on that tail. From here, I'm going to find the single slit that is in the edge of this bobbin case, and it's right there. There's no other slit cut in this circle. I pull the thread tail into the slit, and then I head upwards towards the opening. Again, there's only one opening in this bobbin case. There's nowhere that you can get lost along the way. I pull the thread so that it pops under this spring. This is what gives the bobbin tension. It's a tension spring. The thread has to get under it. You do have to pull firmly, and I'm even immobilizing the bobbin with my finger to give myself some resistance so it'll pop in there. I'm going to do that one more time. Okay, again, I pull on the tail and I make sure that the bobbin is rotating clockwise. I drop it in the bobbin case. I find the single slit where the thread can enter, and I head towards the opening pulling firmly to make the thread pop under that tension spring. Once I do that, that thread should basically hold that bobbin case up by itself. Okay. Now we're going to put that bobbin case in the machine. Here's my little door. I don't have to take off the table to do this, but for visibility, I will. Open that up. And you'll notice I've got a center pin and I've got a little cutout in the black plastic up here. That's my 2 alignments. I hold this up so that the tail here is vertical. I place the center hole on that pin, and then I rotate until that tail fits in its little puzzle piece cutout, and I push forward firmly. That click is really important to hear. It is possible to leave this in a sort of a halfway engaged position, and then it pops out when you're sewing, and it's very scary. I'm going to do that again. To take the bobbin case out, I take this latch here, which releases it, and I just pull back out. Now, usually the bobbin will come with it. I'm just tilting the machine for visibility right now. Okay. One common mistake I see is people treat this latch as a handle. It's not a handle, it's a release latch. So when you put this in and you're trying to engage it, you don't want to be activating the release. Instead, you're just going to hold this bobbin case cradled in your fingers. You're going to put it on that pin and find the point where the tail is aligned with its cutout and push forward firmly. If you're holding that release lever as a handle, you also run the risk of halfway engaging the bobbin case, and it can pop back out at you if it wasn't fully engaged. So I do belabor that point. At this point, I can go ahead and cut my thread on the purpose-made little razor right there and close my door. If I wasn't filming, I could have done that without taking the table off because there is a window for me to see through. Okay, at this point, we're going to thread the machine. Now, I did promise I'd get to why you might use a horizontal spool pin versus the vertical spool pin. We're going to be using the horizontal spool pin, first of all, because it is the sort of normal or typical, and most modern threads are made to come off those spool pins. Notice that this thread has X's on it. It's wound into X's across the core. That means that it is designed to sit horizontally. When it comes off the spool, it's not going to twist, it's not going to have any issues. Now, there are other types of thread. This one is called stack wound instead of cross wound, which is the X's. Stack wound threads just have straight lines going up their cores. And these, while I do recommend that you start by trying them in the horizontal position, they may be more likely to want to sit upright. So when they come off in the horizontal position, there is a chance that they will twist as they do so because they weren't set up to sort of counteract that motion in the way that the cross wounds were. So they might twist a little more. You might get more thread breaks. You might get tension issues. Any sort of wonky on again, off again issues are often thread. Issues with the machine usually happen all the time. Issues that come and go are often a thread thing. So if you're having issues, try popping that thread vertical. This case, we don't immobilize it. It does need to be able to spin. And it would thread then. Whoops, well, you don't want it to do that. You don't want it to pull down below. You thread it into this little paper clip over here to get it going. And it is fussing with me. I'll get that fixed later. And then I would go right over to my normal thread path. That's how I can use that vertical spool pin. Okay, so for threading the machine, we start in the same way. I'm still behind this first hook that I clip into by reaching back here and underneath. At this point, I take the tail of the thread and I run it forward along the slit on the top of the machine. It's very important at this point that your foot be up. Your presser foot gets lifted with a lever and back. This is because the tension discs that control your thread need to be open and accepting thread rather than closed and not accepting thread. So I double check, is my presser foot up? Yes, it is. And so I know that my thread's getting into the tension discs. When I get to the base of this silver thing, I come back up and I start looking for my take-up lever. My take-up lever is this little wiggly lever with a hole in it. If you can't see it, your needle's probably in a position where the needle's down. And so you need to turn your hand wheel. Your hand wheel is the white knob over here until you do see that take-up lever peeking up at you. You go toward the back of the machine along the right-hand wall of the cutout. Then you swing forward along the left-hand wall. That should get you into the opening in the take-up lever. Now, there's a couple points that usually catch people. If you are too gentle, you may not be pulling authoritatively enough to get it to pop past a resistance point in there that's supposed to keep the thread from coming back out. But students who are not authoritative with their thread will sometimes just get stuck back there, and they'll notice that they never see the thread come forward to the loop. It kind of droops toward the back, and that won't work. As soon as you start threading, as soon as you start stitching, it'll come right back out. So you need to pull authoritatively forward. Okay, at this point, we head down to guide number 1, down here. And guide number 2 is right above the needle. And I enter from the left. It's a little paper clip. So to review, we followed the arrows. There are visual aids all over this machine. Threading is no exception. You have to know to start behind this hook, but from there it says go forward, go up, in from the right, out from the left, come down, and then you're just going to remember I got 1, 2 guides. At this point, we'll talk about threading the needle. To thread the needle, I put the presser foot down. This is not required, but you'll see why it's a good idea. Now, you can't save time and put it down ahead of time. Remember that it has to be up when you're threading the main body of the machine. But at this point, I've threaded the main machine. I'm just threading my needle. I put the presser foot down. The second thing I do is I raise my needle to its highest position. I do this using the hand wheel, but you can do this using your needle up-down button, which we'll get into in a minute. The second step here is the most important. If my needle is too low, my needle threader is not going to come down to the correct height, and it A, won't work, B, you might break your needle threader. So if you remember one thing about the threading process, remember to put your needle at its highest position. Now, some of my old school sewers will say, well, if I brought my take-up lever to its highest position so I could thread it when I was threading my machine, my needle must be at its highest position. Actually, not so anymore. They're no longer synchronized. When you move your take-up lever into its position to thread, it's no longer putting the needle at its highest position, so you do have to do that extra step. Okay, at this point, I depress my needle threader. Now, the needle threader is pushing a little hook through the back of the eye of the needle to the front, and our job is going to be to get the thread in front of that hook so that when this retracts, it can pull the thread with it through the eye. We have to get our thread going horizontal, and there is a nubbin built for that purpose right there on the needle threader. I see a lot of people struggling. They'll push this needle threader all the way down, and then it's pretty hard to get back in there. I would recommend that you push your needle threader halfway down, and it's so much easier to get the thread around that little nubbin. Make sure you fully engage your needle threader. You're going to hit resistance right about here. You have to push through it until that needle threader is fully hugging the needle. It will never work if that hook is not all the way through the eye of the needle. So now I've got my thread going horizontal. All I have to do is catch it into a little guide that is cut into this plate of metal that sits to the right of the needle. You'll have to trust me on this. There's a little smile cut into it, and that's the guide that I'm going into. And at this point, I can let the needle threader come back up, and it has pulled a little loop through. I grab the loop, and I help the rest of the tail come all the way through the front. Okay. Let's go over a few common issues that people have. I've already mentioned a few, one of which is the depressing it all the way and then trying to get back at that nubbin. The other one is not fully engaging the needle threader. Must be fully engaged. Now, If you find it easier to go around the other way of the nubbin, that's great. Totally find what works for you. Once you get into the guide, you do need to hold that thread, but you don't want to hold that tail super duper tight because it pulls that loop through from the tail thread. And if you're holding super tight, you'll either rip your thread or the needle threader won't even go anywhere. You'll release it and it won't go anywhere, okay? So make sure as you let that needle threader back up that you are letting that tail come forward. It's loose, so I can get that loop through. Takes me about, let's say, 10 times to build up the muscle memory to use the needle threader. So don't get disappointed if it takes you 10 to 15 times to get used to this needle threader. Do ask for help at your local dealer or from us. It is possible that that little hook in there can get bent, and we're very good at bending them back. Be nice to your needle threader. If you get upset with your needle threader and you start repeatedly smacking it into the needle, you can break it and you will not like the price of replacing it. So be very nice to it. All right, last step before we're ready to sew, I just need to bring up my bobbin thread. I'm going to grab that top thread and manually sew a stitch. Now I can do this with my hand wheel, but let's learn how to use our needle up down button. So our needle up down button is located here on the body of the machine. This is actually a dual function button. It controls two things, the position of the needle and the position that the needle stops. What does that mean? Well, if I push and hold, the needle goes down. If I push and hold again, the needle comes up. So when I push and hold this button, the physical position of the needle right now changes. However, it also changes where the needle will stop when I release the foot pedal. That is indicated by a little icon on screen. It has a picture of a needle with an up arrow. That's going to be the default. When you turn your machine on, that little needle icon is going to look like that. That means that every time I stop sewing, the needle is going to stop in the up position. A lot of us piecers or appliqueurs, people who are pausing and turning corners or turning curves, want our needle to stop in the down position. If you do a quick press of that needle button, the arrow will point down, which means it's going to stop in the down position. And sure enough, we will see that happen when we start sewing. Now, in this process, without really thinking about it, I ended up pulling up my bobbin thread. Let's repeat that one more time so I can be a little more intentional about showing you what I'm doing. Okay, so I hold my top thread, I press and hold to make the needle go down, I press and hold to make the needle go up, and in doing so, I have manually sewn a stitch. I give a little tug on that top thread and the bobbin thread loop pops up. They're both up, they're both back. Good to start sewing. Okay, now we're going to start with the simplest stitch of all, a straight stitch. When we turn the machine on, by default, it's on a straight stitch, and I'll tell you how I know. It's got a little number 1 right here. Now, you could say, oh, that's an illustration of a straight stitch, and you're not wrong, but I happen to know it's a number because if I change stitches to my number 2 stitch, it changes to a number 2, number 3, etc. So this here is going to indicate to you the stitch number that is currently selected. You will have a stitch card that comes with your machine. It should list all the stitches that come on the machine. This being the 335, it has a lot of stitches. The 325 will not have quite as many, but you'll still have a stitch card. The stitch card fits into a handy dandy little slot on the handle, which is cute. So you can slip that up here for easy reference. The good news is for those of us who have lost this card, myself included, you can always find a duplicate in your manual, or you can Google Bernina 335 stitch card, for instance, and find an image of it. So I'm on the number 1 stitch, which is a straight stitch. The foot is recommended. This is a little picture of a presser foot with a number 1 next to it. I have my number 1 foot on. Do I have to obey this instruction? Not at all. You can put a zipper foot on. You can put a blind stitch foot on. There's lots of reasons you would put a specialist foot on that's not the number 1. The machine doesn't know and it's not going to yell at you. It's just a recommendation that you will not break a needle with using the number 1 foot. It's the sort of all-purpose. Okay, the qualities of this stitch are important to understand. How long is the stitch? Where's the needle position? Is there any width to this stitch? So over here, we've got a bar graph. It goes from 0 to 5. This is our stitch length. And right now we can see the bar graph is partially filled with a blinking light right at about 2.4. That means that the stitch is going to be 2.4 millimeters long. We also see a little white dot centered in a little tube of dots up here. This is your needle position, and we'll get into moving that when we talk about the 1/4 inch. We'll leave it centered for now. And finally, we've got a little blinking light up here right under 0 where this indicator goes from 0 to 5.5. This is your width indicator, and a straight stitch by definition has no width to it. That's what makes it straight. All right, let's see how this stitch looks. We lower our presser foot and we depress our foot pedal. When I floor the foot pedal right now, I access the full speed of the machine. That may not be your speed. You are welcome to limit the ability of the floor pedal to reach a maximum speed using the speed control lever here. If I move this lever, or a slider, all the way to the minus, when I floor the foot pedal, I'm going to go slightly slower than if I move it all the way over and floor it. Now, it's not a super perceptible change. We will use this lever more when we get into using the start-stop button instead of the foot pedal, but it gives you a slight ability to vary your speed there. Okay. Now, when you're sewing, you're not likely to just be sewing a straight stitch in the middle of your fabric like me. I've been very carefree here. You're probably wanting to sew a 1/4 inch piecing stitch. So let's talk about how to do that. You can do a 1/4 inch with just the number 1 foot. There is a very subtle marking right in front of the right-hand feed dog. There is an engraving that shows you your 1/4 inch mark. It is backed up by a 1/4 inch engraving on your table here. There's a center line, and then there's a 1/4 inch off to the left and the right. We would use the 1/4 inch line off to the right. So using those two alignments, I can put the fold of my fabric right on top of that engraved line right there. And as I stitch, I'm just going to keep an eye on and make sure the fold is sitting directly on that engraved line. Okay. However, it's not the most precise system in the world. There are other tools available to you to get a good 1/4 inch. First of all, I don't have to use my number 1 foot. There are 2 specialist 1/4 inch feet available for this machine, the 37 and the 57. We'll start with the 37. The 37 is a skinnier foot. The edge of the foot is the 1/4 inch. What that means is that when I put this in place, the edge of that foot should line up directly with the engraving that I already know is a 1/4 inch. This is going to give me a longer sight line or guideline to eyeball against. However, nothing prevents me from, putting my fabric a little too far to the right and accidentally sewing a 3/8 or a generous 1/4 inch. If that is a common issue for you, let's introduce the 57 foot. The 57 foot is the exact same thing as the 37. The edge of the foot is still the 1/4 inch, but it has an extra piece of hardware installed. It has a fence on it, as I call it, or a barrier. So the barrier is going to keep you from slipping past the 1/4 inch. And I can gently run my fabric into that barrier and have it be gently pushed back into position, giving me an accurate 1/4 inch with a little bit less mental labor. Okay. One thing to note is that this is a true 1/4 inch, not a scant one. And so if you need a scant 1/4 inch, you're not out of luck with this foot. You can achieve that. Many people instinctively, to get a skinnier 1/4 inch, would move the edge of their fabric towards the needle. However, doing that takes away the whole purpose of this foot, which is to run the fabric against an established guideline. And you're back sort of guessing where your consistent point is going to be. Instead of doing that, move your needle closer to the edge of the fabric. There is a little bit of wiggle room in this foot, and that wiggle room is on purpose for you to be able to do this. So let's move our needle. Our needle movement is controlled with the center icon up here by the screen. It's got a picture of a needle going into a plate with a dot. Here is a picture of an extended plate. Here's a wide version of the plate with that same dot. And we're going to move the needle 1 click over. And then we can check, does it look like I have any more room to scooch over? Probably not. We'll check. Yeah, that's too close for comfort. So we have room to scooch 1 jump over. And now I'm going to stitch that same line again. You'll see I'm about 0.3 of a millimeter, let's say, closer to the edge. So I can still achieve that scant 1/4 inch and still use my nice barrier that's keeping me accurate. Okay, now I want to reset my needle to center. It's off center right now because of our scant 1/4 inch demonstration. How do I do that? A couple ways. First of all, I can just remember, oh, this one was centered, and move it over using my left-hand arrow key here. However, let's say I don't remember, hey, what was the default setting for stitch number 1? I have a clear button down here that when pressed, resets number 1 back to its normal settings. That's true of if I change the width, the length, all those settings would go back to quote-unquote normal or default. That works for other stitches as well. If I change something else about my number 2 stitch, for instance, and I hit clear, it goes back to default. That's a heck of a lot easier than, for instance, on my length, trying to navigate back down to where that little blinking bar is, which is indicating your default, but still pretty hard to judge where that little blinking light was. Okay, now you may ask yourself, if I go to a different stitch and come back, will it reset? That's a great instinct, and all other brands that we carry do that, where if I change something about this stitch and I go to a different stitch and come back, that should reset the stitch. Bernina doesn't do that. You'll notice I still have a longer stitch. I actually really like that because you can have 2 stitches going with custom settings. You're swapping between a straight stitch and a zigzag stitch, and you don't have to keep resetting a stitch, even though you've had to change stitches. So that's a bonus for me, but I'm going to hit my clear real quick to get that back to default. Okay, so speaking of changing settings, we're going to go ahead and crank this up to its longest length. I've pushed and held on this button, and it went all the way up to 5 and then stopped moving. This is going to be a basting stitch. We're going to check out what this looks like. Okay, so there's my basting stitch. It's 5 millimeters long. If you're following along at home, please feel free right now to go ahead and try that basting stitch and try getting back to default. And you can also discuss with your sewing partners, if you have any right now, why you would use a basting stitch. Okay, now we've talked about messing with your needle position. We've talked about messing with your length. Your length is controlled by the little dashed line getting longer over here, up and down. I can move mine back down to default, for instance. What about width? Can I move my width around? Technically, yes. Your width is controlled by this zigzag getting wider up here. That makes a lot of sense. And as I push on the right-hand arrow, it goes from 0 to 3. Now, I have made this not a straight stitch. I've made it a zigzag. A straight stitch is only a straight stitch when it has 0 width. So really, I wouldn't do this on stitch number 1. I would go to my zigzag stitch, which is number 2. And speaking of which, that's what we're going to do. To change to stitch number 2, I press the number 2. It has presets of its own. It's at a moderate zigzag, moderate length, moderate width, not the maximums. We'll see what the maximums are. We check our recommendation, recommending foot number 1. Again, I don't have to follow that, but at least I know I'm not going to break a needle with foot number 1. Okay. Here's my moderate zigzag. It's modest, but we want to see what this baby can do. We're going to check out some extremes. We're going to change our width out to the very widest, which is 5.5. I do that using the top layer of arrows, and I press all the way to the right until it stops moving. I can then increase my length all the way to 5. So now I've got my longest, widest zigzag. Okay, this is essentially a basting zigzag. What you'll notice is it's a little insecure. I can run my fingernail along these and distort the thread. I can catch, you can tell if I put that on a project, that would catch on something and rip pretty easily. So the longest, widest zigzag is not really adequate for a permanent fixing something to something else. If you're doing a very long and wide zigzag, might I recommend stitch number 4. Stitch number 4 is a zigzag variant. You'll notice this one is preset to be the widest possible. This is really what it's meant for, these really wide zigzags. Go ahead and try number 4 at home if you're following along. Doesn't matter if you have a 325 or a 335, and see if you can tell what's different between this and the number 2 zigzag. I'm going to go ahead and stitch a line of this, and so if you're just watching, go ahead and see if you can tell just from the video what's different. Okay. So the difference is it takes intermediate steps between the maximums of the zigzag. At long lengths, it does end up looking a little bit more like a squiggle, which actually makes this a really cute quilting stitch. You can make this stitch longer and longer. By the time you're up to about 2 millimeters of length, you've got this really nice squiggle going. But for functional purposes, when you're doing a permanent zigzag that you're not going to rip out, and it's very long and very wide, I would recommend using this zigzag stitch that takes the intermediate steps. I did lengthen it. You can tell when it starts out it was very, very short. I went ahead and put my length up to about 1 in order to achieve that length. Okay, one last zigzag variant to show you. Well, let's say 2 more. We'll go back to stitch number 2. And I'll go ahead and clear my custom settings. And in fact, I'm going to take my length all the way down to the kind of funny hatch marks between 0 and 1 that's printed on the screen. So I've got 4 little stacks there, 4 little lines stacked up. Okay. I show you this because I want to show you a satin stitch. A satin stitch is very dense zigzag stitching that ends up looking basically like a pure color. There's no fabric that can be seen underneath, or that's the ideal. I do this because I have been asked, where are the satin stitches programmed on this machine? There are satin stitches. There's decorative ones, 38 through 54, let's say, on this particular stitch card. There are all these dark black ones. Those are all satin stitches, which means that they stitch really close together. So I have been asked, where's the normal satin stitch? The normal one being just a rectangle. Well, they don't program it in because it's just a zigzag stitch with a really short stitch length. And so you manually make that change in order to achieve your satin stitch. Of course, I could make it wider if I was attempting to cover the edge of something, for instance. Okay, last variant of zigzag stitch to show you is number 6 here, and this throws people for a loop. The picture here shows 3 straight lines in a row and then a bolded zigzag. Now, you would be understandably perceiving that this is going to stitch a straight stitch next to a zigzag stitch. It's not, however. It's just a triple stitch. If your width is 0, it's going to do a straight stitch. If your width is not 0, it's going to do a zigzag stitch. No matter what you're doing, it's going to go forward, back, forward. So you're either zigzagging in that pattern or you're just going in a straight line forward, back, forward. Okay, now that we've gone through some zigzag variants, we're going to start introducing some other buttons up and around here. We will go over the reverse button first. So I'm going back to my straight stitch because usually we'll be using our reverse button when we're piecing. A lot of us use the reverse button in this way. We start at the edge of our fabric. We sew a few steps forward. We start pushing our reverse button. We sew a few steps backwards. We let go of the reverse button and we sew forwards again. Notice, if I push and release this reverse button, nothing happens. I must be continuously pushing the reverse button in order to go backwards. As soon as I release it, I start sewing forward again. I can do that whether I'm stopped or whether I'm sewing. I can be going full speed ahead and start pressing that reverse button, no problem. So I can piece at high speeds. What I've mimicked here is a lock stitch. This is me locking both sides of my piecing so that when I go to put these pieces together with each other, they're not going to start unraveling right as I go to put a new seam in, which is infuriating. That said, there is a different way to get this lock stitched straight stitch out of this machine. Number 5 on our stitch selection is an underutilized but very powerful stitch. You can see from the illustration, it's got a lightning bolt on top and a lightning bolt on bottom. It is promising to sew forwards, backwards, and forwards, and then at the end of the seam to sew backwards and forwards, doing what I just did manually with my reverse button. So we're going to push 5 and we're going to try it out. Okay, did you see what happened there? I didn't have to push a reverse button, but it still did that exact same lock stitch that I had to do manually. Now we're going to go down to the end of the fabric. Okay, I'm at the end of my fabric. I'm thinking at the machine, lock stitch, lock stitch. No matter how hard I think, it's not going to lock stitch. That's because it has no way of knowing where we are. It doesn't know, did you stop to take a phone call? Did you stop to sneeze? You don't want the machine to guess when you're done with your seam. You have to physically tell the machine when you're ready for that ending lock stitch. And their choice for what to tell the machine is just, you click the reverse button. Now it's going to sew backwards and forwards, and it force stops. That was not me stopping the machine, it stops itself. I want you to go ahead and try that at home. I'm going to do it again real quick. So forward, does that top lock stitch automatically. Press and release the reverse button when I'm ready for that ending lock stitch. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to the straight stitch and zigzag stitch. I've got one more basic operation option to show you before we get into our little tension talk. That is the start-stop button. The start-stop button is a really cool, really powerful thing. We don't have to unplug our foot pedal to use it, but we're not going to use our foot pedal, so you're going to have to trust me that I'm not pushing on my foot pedal. I push and hold, and the machine starts sewing. I push again to stop. Now it's running awfully fast, so let's slow that down. Push and hold. Now, it's sewing at whatever speed I set with this slider. And so as I speed up the slider or slow down the slider, the machine speeds up and slows down. Push to stop. Okay. Things to remember with the start-stop button. You push the same button to start as to stop, and you have to do a slightly longer push to get it to get going. Why do we have start-stop buttons on machines? If you want to pause the video and think about some reasons we might, it's a good thought exercise for you. But I'm going to go ahead and tell you anyway. There are some activities you might do with a sewing machine that are easier to do with a start-stop button. For instance, when you free motion, it's often easier to set the machine at a consistent sewing speed. Nothing's more consistent than the machine running itself, and to simply worry about moving your quilt at a consistent speed. If you had to sew a tremendous length of drapery, let's say with a decorative stitch, you might be sitting there with your foot on the pedal for a good 5 minutes straight, and it might be easier on your foot to just run it from the start-stop button. Buttonholes are often a great use for the start-stop button. But most of all is it's an accessibility feature. Not all of us are going to be able to use our feet and legs our entire life. Not everyone prefers to sew with their foot. And so you can still use this machine without getting your feet and legs involved using the start-stop button. Okay, from here we're going to go into our tension talk. I want you fresh for our tension talk, so if you need a water break, a brain break, a walk around break, this is a great time to do it. Welcome back for our tension talk. So sewing machine tension, thread tension, is a big point of anxiety for a lot of people, and our goal is to relieve a little bit of that anxiety. Thread never goes anywhere in a sewing machine without tension. There's tension when we wind a bobbin. That's why it's so important to get around this little spring. There's tension when we put the bobbin into the bobbin case. There's a little spring that I made a big deal about pulling the thread into a gap and popping it under that spring. But when we say tension, we're really saying top tension in an abbreviated way. And that's referring to the fact that our top thread runs through two little discs up here, and it is usually mechanically connected in some way to a dial that's very close by. There are other machines that are electronically controlled, and so you won't see a physical dial, but on the 335 and 325, there is still a physical dial, and the fact that it's right next to the discs is no coincidence. It's actually going to be tightening a screw or loosening a screw that is squishing those discs closer together or spreading them further apart. Tension is what it sounds like. It adds tightness to the thread. When I increase this number from 4 to its maximum of it goes up to 10. It's a maximum of 10. I am squeezing these discs harder together. The thread encounters more resistance as it flows through the machine, and we experience that as tightness or tension on the thread. We'll go back down to default, which is helpfully marked with a little red line. Now, when you are stitching with the same thread on the top and the bottom, and you're doing 2 layers of quilting cotton or 2 layers of flannel, you should not have any issue with your stitch. Your stitch should look almost identical front and back. So for instance, we've got very defined stitches on this straight stitch, and we've got very defined stitches on this straight stitch, the front and back. They are essentially the same on front and back. You should be able to achieve that when you're doing the sort of most normal of situations, which is same thread top as on bottom, sort of normal sized sewing weight, and then basic sewing material like quilting cotton. I may mess with the basic tension, the optimal tension, if I change one of those variables. So if I change the color of one of the threads so that my colors are mismatched top and bottom. If I have fleece fabric or knit fabric or simply 2 layers of quilting cotton with batting in between for a quilt sandwich, all of that messes with the sort of optimal settings of the machine. That's not bad. It just means your machine is not set up to have perfect tension in those scenarios. So you're not allowed to get mad at your machine for not sewing perfectly under all conditions we put our machine through. For the purposes of this demonstration, I've actually mismatched my threads on purpose. And that is the main reason that people will have slightly off tensions, is they might have a white from one spool, a white from another spool. They look white to our eyes, but they may have slightly different dye lots, slightly different manufacturers. The one thing I really don't like people to mess with is mismatching a cotton and a polyester. Machines really don't like, tension-wise, having a different material thread on top and bottom. I really do try to match those. The one exception being monofilament, which is a plasticky fishing line type, and that one's special. You only put that one in the top thread. You do not put it in your bobbin thread. Okay, so when my tensions are too low, what will I see and how do I adapt? We're going to go through a couple scenarios here, and I highly recommend that you follow along at home. Okay, so we're going to simulate having our tensions too low by actually lowering the tension number to 1. I'm spreading the discs further apart. They're not going to put as much tightness on the thread. Okay, now we analyze. The top looks fine. I see no difference in this top from what I did before. The back, on which I have green, we can see, I've got a little white showing through. Here and here. I can go down to 0. Let's see if I can get a really drastic version of this. It's a little better. There's a little more white showing through, and in fact some of these are actually little tangled nubs with quite a big loop of white there. When you have this result, it's usually pretty easy to remove the bobbin thread. Oh, unless it's locked. There we go. And then we can really see what's actually going on here, which is those are little loops of white thread showing through. When a stitch forms, the needle travels all the way down into the bobbin area through both layers of fabric, and it grabs the bobbin thread. What happens to that looping point is determined by the tightness of the top thread to a large extent, and it will pull on that looping and pull it upwards into a middle position. However, in this case, we had very, very little tightness or tension on our top thread, and so after the stitch formed, it had very little incentive to move. It kind of stayed right where the stitch was formed. It might have pulled up a little bit, but not much. And so that looping point from the stitch formation is still down below at the bottom of the fabric where it formed. When we see this result, we say, okay, I need to pull a little tighter, I need to increase my tension and bring that looping point upwards. It's a pretty easy thing to visualize. If that looping point, or the top thread, is too low, well, we need to move that top thread up into a middle position. Well, that just means we need to move the number up. So there's this up and up. You up the top thread and you up the number. That's what we're doing there. Now, I might go overkill. Is it possible to have tension too tight? Yes, it is. I'm going to go all the way to 10. Hopefully I won't break my thread. Okay, if you're going about this at home, take a minute before I reveal the answer and look at the top and bottom of your stitch and see if you can tell that this tension is too tight. All right, spoiler, it doesn't actually look bad. That's the interesting thing about tension too tight on a straight stitch, is it just looks like a good straight stitch to a large extent. I don't really see green on top and I don't see white on the bottom. It actually looks great. To see the tension too tight effect, we really have to go to a zigzag stitch. So I go to a zigzag stitch and I actually make it as wide as possible. Another thing I usually need in order to demonstrate this in class is stabilizer. Now I don't have stabilizer with me right now, so I'll just create my own stabilizer and try to double that up, get it to resist a little. You'll see why in a second. Now, it was still on my satin stitch from earlier. It didn't go back to default, but that's okay because we're gonna have a really interesting effect here. So what we can see is a lot of green, while on the back, I don't see any white. So the bobbin thread is coming up to the top, and the white thread is haphazardly in the middle. What's happening here is my top thread is too tight. After that thread is formed, after the stitch is formed between the top and the bobbin, the top thread is yanking really hard, and it's yanking the bobbin thread all the way up. This is a great example of tension too tight, though it is a lot less likely to be seen in your projects. Most of us will see that tension too loose. So again, we think, okay, I'm seeing bobbin thread on top. I need that top thread to relax a little and lower. We need to lower where that meeting point between top and bottom is further down into the fabric. And so I lower the tension number. Okay, now I've got one last pitch for you guys. First of all, you don't have to memorize this explanation, and this may not be the right explanation for your brain. Your manual has a diagram of how tension works. The internet has a plethora of people explaining this, other diagrams. There's lots of resources out there. However, if you don't want to memorize this explanation, it's not sticking in your brain, you've tried, you can always guess your way to the right answer. It's as simple as, I had a weird result. Well, I guess I'll turn my tension one way and try it again. Did it get any better? Ooh, it's worse. Okay, I think I went the wrong way. Well, let me try the other way. Oh, it got a little better. Let me go a little further. Oh, there we go. So as long as you're willing to experiment, you can find the right tension. You don't need to be afraid to mess with your tension. I know a lot of us were taught, never touch the tension dial. Once you mess with tension, you'll never get it back how it was. And that's just not true anymore with well-maintained modern machines. Your tension default is marked by a bright red line. It's the number 4, which is not halfway between 0 and 10, but it's the standard default across a lot of different machines is 4. And so all you have to do to get back to where you were is turn that dial to red, okay? That's my pitch. I encourage you to go forth and mess with your tension until you're comfortable with it. So the last section that we'll do as part of this mastery for this first part is to go through a little bit of the decorative functions of the machine. So we will be starting to use just a few of these fancy stitches that are part of our stitch card. For our purposes, we're going to start with number 25. Now, the tulip is going to be different for the 325 owners, so you will be typing in a slightly different number. But to type in 25, you'll notice 2, 5. Oh, I ended up on stitch number 5. As soon as I type the second number, it forgets the first. It's only ever going to let me have number 5 in this situation. How do I get around that? Well, you have a pound sign or a hashtag. We press the pound sign and then my screen starts to show 2-digit places. So now it's going to let me type in 2 numbers. Astute viewers will probably be able to interpret, if I want stitch number 100, this trick's no longer going to work. 1, 0, 0. Oh, I ended up on stitch number 10 because it stopped listening after the second number was entered. Very simple. I push the pound sign twice. 1, 2. It auto-fills the number 1 for me because it knows there aren't 200 stitches on this machine, so there's no way you would need anything over 1. And then I fill in the second 2 numbers. So if I want stitch 100, I type 0, 0. And now I get stitch number 100. All right, back to number 25. Press pound once, 25. Okay, I can check out my recommended foot there. It still says number 1 is fine, which is great because that's what I've got on there. Let's stitch some tulips. All right, here's your challenge. I want you to stitch me exactly 3 tulips. Okay, I did my best. Let's see how you did. Here's my little tulips, and I did okay actually. I've got 3 complete tulips and I was just starting to stitch away from the 3rd. However, that was probably a little bit stressful for you. You have to keep an eye on where the leaves are stitching and where the flowers are stitching. There's got to be an easier way, and there is. When you want to end a decorative stitch, you can press this button up here, which is a triangle with a line at the bottom. In this case, the triangle is just a random placeholder for a stitch. Just like in algebra, X is a placeholder for any number. Well, our triangle is our X, that's a placeholder for any stitch. So, again, our exercise, I'm going to try to stitch 3 tulips, but I'm going to stop when I see the 3rd tulip start to be stitched. There's 1, there's 2, and I know I'm on my 3rd at this point. I push the pattern end button, and it confirms it for me by putting the same icon on the screen. Okay, I'm not stopping the machine, it is stopping itself. It force stops at the end of that tulip, and without much effort other than counting to 2 and waiting until the 3rd one started, I got the perfect end to my tulip. Now, a word of warning from personal experience. Once you turn on pattern end, it stays on. You'll notice that icon is still there. It will perpetually stop after 1 stitch is completed, so 1 tulip. So if I start again, again, it stops, it force stops after 1 tulip. Not a big deal. I think in that case, most of us would realize what is happening. But here's where you get into trouble. You go back to stitch number 1. You're done with your decorative stitches and you're going to piece. Notice the icon's not gone away. So now when I go to stitch, this is what's going to happen to me. It shows 1 stitch and it force stops. 1 stitch and it force stops. This is really confusing and really distressing. You can't figure out what on earth you've done to your machine. Usually what it is that pattern end is still on, it's still forcing stopped after every single stitch, and you just have to push this button again to make it go away. Okay, now we're going to get into a feature that the 335 has. The 325 does not, but it's very simple to understand, and you can just keep watching. 325 owners will be through this real quick. So I'm going to go back to stitch number 25. This is our tulip, and we've already established that our tulip stitches out to the right, facing to the right. If I push this button here, which is 2 triangles back to back, I flip it, and it's now going to be facing off to the left, and I'll prove it. Okay. As promised, our tulip is now facing off to the left. So this is a reflection. That's what that triangle back to back is showing you. That's it looking in a mirror, and it's reflective. I know that I have the reflection active because there's a reflection icon on screen. It's always telling me on screen what I have active. Okay. So those are our 2 main decorative choices that we have. I'm not obviously going to go through the exhaustive list of what there is here. I just want to mention that your maximum width for decorative stitches is 5.5 millimeters, and most of them are going to be set up to be maxed out already. You can make them longer using our length. You can make them less wide, decreasing our width, but they cannot get any bigger. My tulip cannot get any taller. Okay? All right, that's going to conclude the first part of this mastery. We've gone through basic utility and decorative stitches. In our next part, we will be going through using the memorize and the alphabet in order to plug in a name and do a little label. And we'll also be going through cleaning and maintenance.